Hello everybody, and welcome to this, my third of 3 videos on the Nikon N80. And in this video we're going to talk about the custom functions menu. There are 18 custom functions in this, so we're going to cover all of them and talk about what they are and how they work. So to enter the custom functions, what you need to do is go to CSM on your custom mode dial. Now, next thing is all of the defaults in your custom modes are 0. Whatever the 0 setting is, it's the default. I think there might be a couple of exceptions to that, and I will note that when we get to them. So, to navigate the custom functions, what you'll do is use the rear dial. This advances you. You can go either way, up or down, and it wraps. And this will take you to the different custom functions. The front dial adjusts which function setting you've selected. So this adjusts the option, this adjusts the dial, or the setting. And I'm mentioning that because I'm about to switch to the macro lens, so you should basically see not a whole lot more than the LCD screen. Custom function 1 is automatic rewind or manual rewind. So in 0, when you hit the end of a roll of film, it will automatically be rewound into the cassette. With 1, you have to hold this button and this button down at the same time in order to manually rewind the film. Matter of personal preference whether you want automatic or manual rewind. Function 2 is resetting the DX for new film. With 0, which is the default, your camera will use the DX code read off of the cassette for each roll of film. So if you remember, we saw on the back of the camera those DX code pins along the inside. Those are used by the camera to understand what kind of film you have. So with function 0, every time you put a roll of film in that has that DX code, the camera will read it and follow the DX code's information. With option 1, then the camera will not use the DX code and simply remember from roll to roll what you have entered into it. So let's say you have 10 rolls of 400 speed film and you're going to shoot all of them at 3200 because you're at an indoor sporting event and you don't want to have to manually override every single roll of film that night. You can come in here to custom function 2 and adjust that to not use the DX code, get your settings done once, and then just pop the rolls of film in and out as you need them, and you will be in good shape for shooting for the whole night. Option 3 is your bracketing order. Now this works with the bracketing function that we saw in video 2, and if you still are kind of fuzzy on bracketing, the PDF manual is linked in the description, and it's on page 62 is how bracketing works. 0 will give you a bracketing order of correct exposure, followed by underexposure, followed by overexposure. 1 gives you underexposure, correct, over. This is a matter of personal preference. I tend to like having it show under, correct, over, because then it's really easy to see a sequence of this was one shot, and here are these 3 different bracketed versions of it. When you get your negatives back, and you can then easily evaluate on your negatives which one is the proper exposure. 4 is your on-demand Gridline superimposition in the viewfinder. So if you're looking at your viewfinder and it doesn't have a grid line, you can switch this to 1 and you'll get grids. And those grids are really useful for composition, lining up your verticals and your horizontals in your scene. And I personally love a grid viewfinder. I think it's the best kind of viewfinder. And so you'll notice I have it set to on with this camera. But if you don't like the grid, if you find it distracting, you can turn that off by switching that to 0. Custom function 5 is your illumination for superimposition. And what this does is your autofocus points turn, I thought it was red, but actually I think they're just dark colored, I'm not sure, when your focus is obtained. And 0, it's done automatically in low light. and 1, it's done never. And since I haven't, and 2, it's done always. So those are the options. I like to have my autofocus points light up when it figures out which one, but matter of personal preference and battery life, although honestly the light from the autofocus indicator isn't eating up that much battery life. 6 is your focus area selection. Now, when we looked in the second video about your focus point using that cross pad on the back, and I said you can make the world wrap like in old video games, or have a wall, this is that option. If you are on 0, then the world has boundaries. So the cross point, if you push down a dozen times, it's only going to go to the bottommost focus point. It's not going to go up to the top, then middle, then bottom. With option 1, the world wraps. So if you keep pushing down, it'll just keep going down and down and down, and then the bottom, when it gets to that, then it next goes up to the top when you push down again. Just personal preference, which one you like. Number 7 is the auto exposure lock when shutter release is lightly pressed. 0 means that there is no auto exposure lock when the button is half depressed, and 1 means that there is. So the difference is that if you have this set to 0, metering will change if you recompose your image. If you have it set to 1, metering will not change if you recompose your image. And that should be set to 1. So let's say that you are sitting under an awning with a brightly lit background and a dark foreground because you're sitting in the shade. If you use 0 for this setting, and you compose and take a meter reading off of your subject who's sitting in front of you with the bright light behind them, and then recompose to get them off to the side of the frame, what's going to happen is that the meter reading will readjust when you recompose, and then the background will be properly illuminated and your subject in the foreground will be improperly illuminated. If you have this set to 1, as long as you keep the shutter button depressed when you recompose, then you will not lose your exposure setting. You can also, if you have this set to 0, you still have the ability to use auto exposure lock and autofocus lock, that button on the back of the camera, to maintain your exposure setting. If you're in manual mode, then you just set whatever you want and don't worry about the camera readjusting your settings when you recompose. Number 8 is your auto film loading when back closes. And in the second video when we looked at film loading, I mentioned that there was a setting to adjust that, whether or not it automatically loaded or if you had to press the shutter button halfway first. This is that setting. So if you have it to 0, what happens is as soon as you close the film back, the film advances. If you have it set to 1, you can put the film in, but it will not advance until you have to press the shutter button. Matter of personal preference for this. For 9 is the closest subject priority dynamic autofocus in single servo AF option. That's a mouthful of technical salad. So let's figure out what this is. In 0, it's enabled, and in 1, it's disabled. All right, so we'll just get that out of the way. What this mode does is that it gives you autofocus priority to whatever is in the foreground. So let's say that you're looking at a subject, they're in the foreground, and then the Eiffel Tower is in the background, right? Autofocus priority goes to the person who is standing in front of the Eiffel Tower and closer to you than to the Eiffel Tower. This only applies to single servo autofocus, by the way. And there are some other considerations for using this that are worth reading. If you're curious about it, check out the manual, open it up in a new tab, and go to page 40. And the link to that, of course, is in the video description. And it's worth reading the blurb in the manual to fully understand how this works before you make a decision on which setting you want to use when you're configuring your camera. 10 is Closest subject priority dynamic autofocus in continuous servo auto mode. 0 is enabled, I'm sorry, 0 is disabled, 1 is enabled. Everything I just described for number 9, it's the exact same thing, only in continuous servo mode instead of single servo mode. Again, page 40, it's worth reading. But basically, if what they did was instead of having both autofocus modes work the same way with this setting, they gave each of the 2 autofocus modes a separate setting in this menu so you could have them function differently if you needed to. So that if you're at a sporting event, if you were to enable this, let's say, and you had somebody running through the track and you're tracking them, they're in focus and focus, oh, someone's head gets in the way. That head's in focus, head's in focus, head's in focus, and now it refocuses to the person who's running. So basically, if you have this, so in single servo, in my mind, it makes a little bit more sense to have it enabled, and in continuous servo, it makes a little bit more sense to have it disabled, but 100% a matter of personal preference and shooting style based on what you want and need. Okay, so let's talk about function 11. This is a complicated one to really understand. There are 5 options, 0 through 4, and every option affects how the AEL AFL button on the back of the camera operates. With 0, when you push this button, auto exposure and autofocus both lock. So let's say that you have a scene where you have a person running in the background in a straight line in consistent lighting. This will work just fine. If they start in the shadow when you get your auto exposure lock and then run into some light, then you will overexpose because your exposure lock will have occurred when they're in shadow. If they're running towards you, your autofocus will lock at where they were when you first got focus lock, and then as they move toward you, they will become increasingly blurry. Same thing if they start in the shade and they move toward you into the light, not only will they become increasingly blurry, they'll become increasingly overexposed because the exposure and focus will be locked back here where they were in the shade. So that's how that works, and that means that if you hold the AEL AFL button down and then take your picture after a couple of seconds, the lighting and focus point could have moved and you could end up with an improperly exposed and blurry photo. In 1, what you get, oops, that's 4. In 1, what you get is auto exposure locking only. So if you hold this down, it will lock your exposure when you start, but you can still change your focus. So if you have someone here who's running, it's daylight, they're in a field, they're running towards you, you lock your exposure here, and then you can track their focus as they run towards you. Or if they're in the shade here and they run towards you, you'll keep your focus, but the exposure will be locked to where they were when they were in the shade. If we go to option 2, what happens is autofocus only locks, meaning that your focus point locks, but your exposure can change. So if you have somebody starting over here in the shade and running horizontally across your frame, then your focus point will lock here, which is fine, and your exposure will change as the lighting changes as they exit the shade and then get into brighter light. With option 3, the AE lock is with button toggle. So everything we talked about before was with holding down the button. With option 3, the auto exposure will lock, which is what happens with option 2, but it's on and off. So you don't have to hold it down, you just have to tap it once. With option 4, autofocus operation only occurs when the AEL and AFL button are pressed, not when the shutter is released, so half pressed. So right now, if in option 4 we're at, if you select it, you push down the shutter button the whole way, the autofocus will not trigger. Autofocus will only trigger if you hold down this button on the back. So option 11 is strictly a matter of how you use your camera, the types of subjects you shoot, and personal preferences to which one of those modes you want to use. Option 12 is your command dial functions in manual mode only. So when we saw on the other dial over there shooting in M mode, option 12 affects that. In 0, rear command dial operates the shutter speed, front command dial operates the aperture. And with 1, that's reversed. So that's a matter of personal preference. Which way do you like your command dials working? In aperture priority and shutter priority mode, the mode dials, which dial controls which function, are the same as they would be in manual mode. The non-assigned dial in each mode, regardless of which setting you use for 12, is typically dead. So what that means is that if you're in aperture priority mode, both dials don't adjust the aperture. Option 13 is film rewind. 0 is high speed and 1 is quiet. So this is just a matter of preference. Do you want it to be fast or quiet? At high speed, which is 0, it's 15 seconds to rewind a 36 exposure roll. In quiet, it's 23 seconds. 14 is the multiple exposure function. In 0, single shutter release, or at 1 it's continuous shutter release. So if you remember from video 2, at the very end, I showed you how to do double exposures. Now I have it set to 0 because I want a double exposure every time I press the shutter release. I don't want to hold the shutter release down and have it take multiple exposures. This is basically what drive mode, single or continuous, you're using in double exposure mode. Matter of personal preference, but realistically, if you want to ensure the highest quality results for your double exposures, you want this to be in single shot mode, so 0. 15 is your meter turn off time. Strictly personal preference on this one, but these are not 0 through 1. These are 4, 6, 8, and 16, and the number that you see here corresponds with how many seconds the meter will stay on after you have to press the shutter button. That's it. I like 16, but I don't fault anyone for liking 4, especially with how expensive the batteries are for this camera. Function 16 is the self-timer duration, and this is another one where you have the seconds displayed, not different options. So whatever the number is there, I have 10, is how many seconds, and 10's the default, your self-timer will display. The other options are 2, 5, and 20. Option 17 is LCD illumination, 0 and 1. 1 enables the LCD illumination. So what this does is this causes the LCD to turn on with any function button operation, which is option 1, or not, which is option 0. So there's an LCD light here, but with option 1, anytime you push any button on the camera, the LCD is going to light up. It's just a matter of personal preference on that. That should actually be 0. And 18, the last one, is the autofocus assist light, and that's the light up on the front that helps the autofocus in dark settings. 0 is it will be enabled. 1 is it is disabled. So if you are taking this camera to see your kids play and it's dark and you don't want the autofocus assist light to turn on and distract all the kids on stage and cause mass hysteria and bedlam, then you set this to 1 so that that light won't turn on. Now, if you want to reset all of your settings to 0, which is the default for all of them except for meter turn off time, which is 6 seconds, and self timer, which is 10, what you want to do is hold the bracket button over on the other side of the camera on the back of it, and the exposure compensation button, which is this one right here. And you can tell which one it is because this has a green button and the corresponding bracket button has a green button next to it. So if you find the two buttons with green dots next to them and hold those down for 2 seconds, you will reset all of your custom functions. And that is it for the Nikon N80. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. if you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos. And if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.